She thought she had lost everything when she was thrown off the bus with her kids on a dark highway, but that's where the miracle began that changed her life forever. The driver's shout was sharp and merciless, his voice echoing over the rumble of the engine as the doors hissed open. "Out," he barked, as if Sarah Miller and her children were nothing more than an inconvenience delaying his route. She had no time to plead or explain further. The heavy doors clanged shut, and the bus roared away, its red taillights shrinking until they blurred into the winter fog. For a long moment, Sarah stood still on the edge of the frozen highway, clutching the hands of her daughters as if they might slip away too. The cold air bit into her lungs, raw and punishing, and the cruel reality settled in: they were stranded. The twins, Lily and Lucy, pressed themselves against her coat, their tiny bodies shivering in unison. At just 2 years old, they understood only enough to sense fear. Sarah bent down and tried to smile, smoothing their brown curls with trembling fingers. She whispered that everything would be all right, but the lie trembled in her own voice. Her pocket was empty, her wallet useless now that her ex-husband had frozen every card. She had scraped together what little cash she had for the bus tickets, believing it would be enough to get them to the city where she could start fresh. But the driver demanded more, muttering about extra seats and no free rides for kids, and when Sarah confessed she had nothing left, he gave her a look so dismissive it burned worse than the cold. Then, without hesitation, he put her and her children out in the middle of nowhere. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, silent except for the occasional gust that whipped through the barren trees. Cars sped past, headlights flashing briefly before disappearing, and not one of them slowed. Sarah pulled the girls closer, feeling the sting of her own helplessness. She had promised herself she would never let Mark, her ex, see her defeated again, but here she was, standing like a shadow on the side of the highway, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake in running at all. Her breath came in visible clouds as she tried to think of options. There were none. No shelter in sight, no town within walking distance that she could see. The girls were whimpering now, their teeth chattering as they buried their faces against her. She lifted them one after the other, trying to shield them with her body heat, though her arms were already aching from carrying the bags she had brought. Those bags now sat uselessly at her feet, their contents barely enough for survival, let alone comfort. Just when she thought the weight of despair might crush her, a glow appeared in the distance. Headlights, brighter and steadier than the ones that had sped past before, grew larger as the sound of an engine approached. The vehicle slowed, its tires crunching over the icy gravel. A sleek black SUV came to a stop a few feet ahead, and for a moment Sarah's pulse spiked with panic. She held her breath, unsure whether to trust whoever sat behind the wheel. The driver's side door opened, and a tall man stepped out, his breath clouding in the frigid air. Blonde hair caught the faint glow of the headlights, and his blue eyes, sharp and startling, fixed on her with immediate concern. His long coat swung as he walked toward her, his shoes crunching against the frozen ground. Sarah instinctively pulled the girls tighter, her body rigid with caution. "You're freezing out here," he said, his voice steady but not commanding, more like a hand extended in calm assurance. He pulled off his gloves and held them out to her. "Please, take these." Sarah hesitated, her pride and fear wrestling inside her. Strangers had not been kind to her lately, and she had learned that trust was dangerous. Yet she saw the way his gaze softened when it fell on the twins, how his posture bent slightly as though he were trying not to frighten them. She slipped the gloves over her numb hands, whispering a quiet thank you, almost afraid that speaking too loudly might break the fragile safety of this moment. "My name is Ethan Blackwood," he continued. "It isn't safe here, not in this cold, not on the road. Let me take you somewhere warm." For a heartbeat, Sarah said nothing, torn between instinct and desperation. But as the girls clung tighter, their small bodies trembling against her, she realized the cold was deciding for her. Whatever risks lay ahead, they could not be worse than staying stranded on that highway with the night closing in. She gave the faintest nod. Ethan's expression softened further, and with one practiced motion, he gathered up the heavier of her bags, leaving her free to carry her daughters. The SUV's doors opened, spilling a wave of warm air that smelled faintly of leather and coffee. Sarah lifted Lily and Lucy into the back seat, where they instantly burrowed into the seats as if they were clouds. She climbed in after them, the warmth wrapping around her like a fragile promise. As the car eased back onto the road, Sarah looked out at the shrinking patch of pavement where her nightmare had begun, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe. The future was still unknown, still dangerous, but something had shifted. She was no longer alone on that endless highway. Inside the SUV, the world felt entirely different, as though Sarah and her daughters had been lifted out of one reality and dropped into another. The air was warm, humming gently with the quiet rhythm of the engine, and the smell of leather mixed with the faint trace of roasted coffee. The twins immediately sank into the back seat, their little bodies relaxing as though they had stumbled into a hidden sanctuary. Lily closed her eyes almost instantly, the rise and fall of her chest slowing as sleep claimed her, while Lucy sat upright, wide-eyed, her tiny hands reaching curiously toward the glowing dashboard lights. Every button, every dial fascinated her, as if she had stepped into a magical machine. Ethan glanced back through the rearview mirror, his gaze softening when he saw the children. "There's a gas station not far from here," he said, his tone even and reassuring, as though speaking to someone he had known for years. "We'll stop there for a bit. Hot chocolate, something warm for the girls, maybe a chance for all of you to catch your breath." His words landed gently, without pressure, and yet there was a calm authority in them, the kind that made Sarah feel she could let go of control just for a moment. She sat rigid at first, her arms folded across her chest, uncertain whether it was wise to relax. The adrenaline of the last hour still ran sharp through her veins, and her instincts screamed caution. But the heat from the car seeped into her bones, thawing the ache in her fingers and the stiffness in her joints. For the first time that night, she felt her body begin to unclench. The girls, sensing her shift, melted further into the seats, safe in the cocoon of warmth. When the SUV pulled into the bright glow of the gas station, Sarah blinked against the sudden flood of light. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few trucks idling on the far side. Ethan killed the engine and turned to her. "Stay here with them. I'll be quick." Before she could protest, he was already out of the car, his stride purposeful as he disappeared into the store. Through the glass she watched him move from aisle to aisle, tall and precise, gathering things with a focus that surprised her. He did not look like a man running an errand, he looked like someone executing a plan. Within minutes he emerged with 2 large paper bags. When he slid back into the driver's seat, the car filled with the comforting smell of cocoa and fresh bread. He handed Sarah 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate with lids too big for the girl's small hands, then pulled out thick fleece blankets, tiny pairs of socks decorated with cartoon animals, and even a pair of soft plush bunnies, one pink and one gray. The twins woke at the smell of chocolate, their eyes wide with sudden delight. Lucy squealed and reached for the pink bunny while Lily clutched the gray one with both arms, as though it were already hers forever. They sipped carefully at the cocoa, noses pink, eyes shining with wonder. For the first time since leaving home, they giggled. The sound was fragile but real, and it wrapped itself around Sarah's heart like a lifeline. She sat there in silence for a moment, overwhelmed by the strange contrast between despair and comfort, between the cruelty of being abandoned on the road and the unexpected kindness of this man beside her. Finally, she found her voice, though it came out quieter than she intended. "Why did you stop?" Ethan's eyes remained on the road as he pulled the SUV back onto the highway. "Because once, when I needed someone to stop, no one did," he said simply. His answer was not rehearsed or polished, but heavy with truth, a fragment of a story left untold. He didn't elaborate, and Sarah did not push. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself and her daughters, letting the warmth and the cocoa and the safety of the moment sink into her. For the first time in weeks she allowed herself to believe that perhaps this night might not end in disaster, that perhaps the road ahead held more than fear. As the lights of the gas station disappeared behind them, she leaned her head against the cold window, feeling the glass vibrate softly beneath her temple, and allowed exhaustion to pull her slowly toward sleep. The last sound she registered before drifting off was the steady hum of the engine and the quiet breath of the man who had chosen to stop. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and worn linoleum, a mixture that carried both comfort and unease. Sarah sat on the edge of a narrow cot while the twins clung to her sides, their small bodies trembling more from exhaustion than cold now. A nurse bustled around them with gentle efficiency, checking the girls' temperatures, listening to their heartbeats, and murmuring reassurances in a calm, practiced tone. The girls were declared stable, only mild hypothermia, nothing that warm blankets and rest could not cure. Sarah exhaled a breath she had not realized she had been holding, relief making her shoulders sag as though a weight had been momentarily lifted. But her own reprieve was short-lived, because the nurse's eyes lingered on her wrists. The faint yellowing bruises, some fading, others fresh and deep, told their own story, and no amount of tugging at her sleeves could erase what they revealed. Sarah felt the nurse's gaze like a spotlight on a secret she was trying to bury. The woman said nothing, only offered a sympathetic look before slipping out of the room. Minutes later, a tall man in uniform appeared. His badge caught the harsh fluorescent light as he stepped in with quiet authority, introducing himself as Officer Reed. His tone was not harsh or accusing but steady, the kind of voice that coaxed truths out from where they hid. He pulled up a chair, sitting level with her rather than looming over her, and began gently asking questions. Where had she been traveling from? Why was she on the highway with 2 toddlers in the freezing dark? What had led her to this place, this moment? Sarah hesitated, every instinct telling her to stay silent, to protect the fragile privacy she had built around her pain. But there was something in the officer's calm patience that eroded her defenses, and the words began to spill out, halting at first, then faster, as though once the dam cracked there was no stopping the flood. She told him about Mark Dalton, her ex-husband, who had seemed charming and perfect to the outside world but who turned their home into a cage. She told him how he controlled everything, the money, the accounts, the house, and how every attempt to assert her independence was met with icy fury. After the divorce, he had used every legal loophole he could find to trap her, freezing the funds they once shared, threatening court battles he knew she could not afford, and always reminding her that she was powerless. She described the fear that lived in her chest, the way she had spent nights staring at the ceiling, wondering when the next blow would fall, whether in words or fists. Finally, she explained the desperate decision that had brought her here: 2 tickets on a bus, purchased with the last of the cash she had hidden away, a suitcase stuffed with the bare minimum, and a plan that was less a plan than a prayer. She wanted only to get her daughters to the city, to disappear into its anonymity, to find work and scrape together a new life before Mark could track them down. The words caught in her throat as she described how the bus driver had demanded more money, how her empty pockets had betrayed her, and how he had thrown them out as if they were baggage, not people. Officer Reed listened without interruption, his pen moving across the pad in his hand, but his eyes never leaving her face. When she faltered, when the shame of speaking her truth threatened to silence her, he gave a slight nod, urging her to continue. By the time she finished, Sarah felt both lighter and more exposed, as though she had peeled away the last layer of armor she possessed. When the officer left to file his report, the room was quiet again except for the sound of the girl's soft breathing. Sarah lowered her face into her hands, the weight of her situation pressing down harder now that it was spoken aloud. She expected silence, perhaps even judgment, but instead she heard Ethan's voice from across the room. "This is not your fault," he said, the words clear and steady. He had been leaning against the wall, giving her space as she spoke, but now he stepped closer, his expression unreadable yet firm. "The bus driver will answer for what he did, and so will your ex. You won't face this alone." Sarah lifted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly as her instinctive defenses rose again. "I don't need charity," she said quickly, her voice sharp with pride and the fear of being pitted. Ethan did not flinch at her tone. Instead, he leaned forward, his gaze steady, his words deliberate. And I'm not offering it. What I'm offering is safety. 48 hours. Nothing more, unless you want it. 2 days where you don't have to run, don't have to wonder where your children will sleep, don't have to fight every second just to survive. After that, you decide what comes next. No strings. The finality of his statement struck her. It was not a plea, not an attempt to pull her into debt or gratitude, but a simple promise delivered with quiet conviction. Sarah's throat tightened. For so long every offer she had heard came with a catch, a hook hidden beneath the kindness, but in his voice she could not detect one. She looked at her daughters curled up on the cot, their tiny hands wrapped around the stuffed bunnies he had bought them, and felt her resolve weaken against the tide of exhaustion and hope. In that moment she realized that survival alone was no longer enough. Perhaps, for the first time in years, there was a chance at something beyond just enduring. And though she could not say it out loud yet, she knew she would take the 48 hours. The city rose around them like a constellation of steel and glass, its lights sharp against the winter night. Sarah sat in silence as the SUV glided between high-rise towers, the twins pressed against the windows with wide eyes, marveling at the skyline as if it were a fairy tale painted across the horizon. Every block they passed seemed to pulse with life, restaurants spilling warm light onto sidewalks, people hurrying with shopping bags, and glowing signs flickering in the cold air. For Sarah, who had been consumed by survival for so long, the city looked both intimidating and full of impossible promise. Ethan drove without unnecessary words, giving her space to watch the streets, as though he knew she needed the silence. When he finally pulled into a quieter neighborhood, the noise of the city fell away. They stopped before a modest building with a warm, golden glow spilling from its lobby. Sarah looked at it in confusion, unsure what this stop meant, until Ethan stepped out and opened her door, lifting the heavier of her bags before she could argue. Inside, the building smelled of polished wood and faint lavender, not the sterile scent of hotels she remembered from rushed trips with her ex. The lobby was small, almost homely, with potted plants arranged neatly by the walls and a worn leather couch near the front desk. Behind it, an older man greeted Ethan with a nod, not with the rehearsed politeness of an employee meeting a wealthy client, but with the familiarity of someone who had seen him before. It was clear that Ethan was not simply a guest here, he was someone who belonged. They took the elevator up to a quiet floor, and Ethan unlocked a door to a furnished apartment. The moment Sarah stepped inside, her breath caught. The apartment was simple but warm, soft beige walls, clean linens folded on the couch, a small kitchen stocked with basics, and, most importantly, a second bedroom where 2 small beds sat side by side, each with fresh sheets and tiny lamps shaped like stars. It was not luxury, but it was safe, and for Sarah, that felt richer than any mansion. The twins ran instantly to the bedroom, climbing onto the beds and squealing at the way the little lamps glowed when they pressed the buttons. Their laughter filled the space, so bright it almost hurt Sarah's chest to hear it. She stood frozen, overcome by a mix of gratitude and suspicion, wondering why this man she barely knew would go to such lengths for her. Ethan set her bags down and placed a small white card on the counter. Sarah picked it up almost absent-mindedly, then stopped when she read the words printed in crisp black letters, Ethan Blackwood, CEO, Northbridge Logistics. Her eyes darted to him, her mind struggling to reconcile the man who had bought stuffed animals at a gas station with the polished title staring back at her. "You're a director?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could think. He gave a small, amused smile, as if the question barely scratched the truth. "Chief executive, technically. But right now, I'm someone making sure your girls have warm pajamas." The simplicity of the response disarmed her. He did not deliver it with arrogance or pride, it was said as casually as if he were describing the weather. Still, the reality of his position made her wary. People like Mark had taught her that power and wealth often meant control, and she was not about to exchange one prison for another. Before she could retreat into her doubts, there was a knock on the door. Ethan opened it to reveal a tall woman in a gray suit, her presence sharp and professional. Her dark hair was pulled neatly into a bun, and a leather briefcase hung at her side. She introduced herself as Olivia Hunt, an attorney, her voice calm and measured. Sarah stiffened instinctively, bracing for questions she could not answer, but Olivia's expression held none of the judgment Sarah feared. Olivia sat at the small kitchen table, laying out papers with practiced ease. She explained that they would file for a temporary restraining order against Mark, detailing the abuse and the financial control he had exercised. She spoke with quiet confidence about gathering camera footage from the highway to prove the bus incident, and she assured Sarah that she would not be standing alone in front of a judge. Every word was delivered with the certainty of someone who knew the system and knew how to fight within it. As Sarah listened, something shifted deep inside her. She was so used to being cornered, to anticipating the next blow, the next threat, that the idea of someone stepping forward on her behalf felt foreign, almost unreal. The twins padded back into the room, still clutching their new bunnies, their faces flushed with excitement, and Sarah caught sight of their reflections in the window, two little girls, safe for the night, unaware of the storm their mother carried. Her chest tightened with emotion she could not quite name. Part of her wanted to collapse into relief, to let this unexpected alliance carry her forward. Another part wanted to keep her guard up, to remind herself that trust had always been her undoing. Yet as Olivia packed away her papers and Ethan quietly brewed tea in the small kitchen, she realized that for the first time in years she was not calculating her escape route. She was not rehearsing apologies or excuses. She was simply breathing. When Olivia left with a promise to return in the morning, Sarah lingered by the window, watching the glow of the city below. Ethan handed her a cup of tea, his movements unhurried, as if he understood that her world was still balancing on a fragile edge. "This isn't permanent," he said softly. "It's just a place to start. You decide what comes next." Sarah held the cup, feeling the warmth seep into her hands, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward where she did not have to walk alone. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that creeps into every corner of a strange place and keeps you half awake no matter how safe you try to feel. Sarah lay in the bed provided for her, the soft mattress almost too comfortable after weeks of restless nights. At first she thought she might sleep straight through, but her dreams betrayed her. She jolted awake to the sound of imaginary bus doors slamming shut, the echo of the driver's cruel voice in her ears, and the vision of red taillights vanishing into the distance. Her chest tightened as though she were back on the frozen roadside again, stranded and powerless, the twins crying at her knees. She sat up, her breathing unsteady, and pressed her palms against her face until the trembling slowed. From the other side of the apartment came a muffled voice, calm and deliberate. She held her breath to listen. Ethan was on the phone, his tone quiet so as not to disturb anyone, but the words carried into the stillness. He was speaking with someone named Grace, clearly his assistant, and the fragments of the conversation reached her in measured pieces. He was talking about company buses, about safety regulations, about children. His voice carried none of the detachment she expected from a businessman, no cold calculation about profit and loss. Instead there was urgency, a conviction that sounded almost personal. "New training for the drivers," he was saying, his words steady. "Priority seating for mothers, mandatory child restraints, and I want this implemented immediately, not next quarter. We don't wait for policies after someone suffers. We do it now." There was a pause as he listened, then his voice softened slightly. "I don't care what the cost is. No family should face what I saw tonight." Sarah pulled her knees to her chest and stared into the dark, the weight of his words pressing against her doubts. This was not charity. This was not a man handing out scraps of his wealth to soothe his conscience. He was reshaping something larger, and he was doing it because of what had happened to her and her children on the side of that road. It unsettled her almost as much as it comforted her, because it suggested that her nightmare had already changed the course of something far beyond herself. By morning the apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and oats. When she stepped into the small kitchen, still in the oversized sweater someone had left for her, she found Ethan at the stove with his sleeves rolled up, stirring oatmeal in a pot. The image was so unexpected that for a moment she simply stared. The CEO, whose name was printed on pristine cards, the man whose suit had probably cost more than her monthly rent back in the life she had fled, now stood barefoot in a borrowed kitchen, cooking breakfast like an ordinary father. The twins sat at the table, their cheeks rosy, demanding more raisins with impatient little voices. Ethan responded with a patience that surprised her, scooping a spoonful of dried fruit into their bowls as though it were the most natural thing in the world. When he noticed Sarah watching, he gave a small smile but said nothing, allowing her to take in the scene without forcing her into it. She sat down slowly, feeling awkward and oddly at ease at the same time, the contrast pulling at her in unfamiliar ways. For a while they ate in silence, the only sounds the clinking of spoons and the twins' delighted chatter. Finally Sarah looked up, her curiosity pressing past the walls she kept so carefully built. "Last night," she began, her voice hesitant, "you said no one stopped for you once. What did you mean?" Ethan put his spoon down and leaned back in his chair. His expression grew distant, as though he were reaching for something buried deep in his memory. "I was 9 years old," he said after a long pause. "My mom worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. One night she was late picking me up from school. I waited at the bus stop, soaked through in the rain, clutching a backpack that weighed more than I did. The bus pulled up, but when the driver saw I didn't have the exact fare, he shut the doors and drove off." He looked at her then, his eyes steady. It was a small thing to him. Just a boy who could catch the next one. But to me, it felt like the world didn't care if I was left behind. That feeling never really left. Sarah listened intently, her fingers tightening around the warm ceramic of her mug. His story was not hers, yet the emotion in it mirrored something in her own life, the countless times she had been dismissed, ignored, left stranded not on a road but in her marriage, in courtrooms, in every place where she had begged silently for someone to see her. She realized then that his actions the night before had not been random. They were born from an old wound, from a promise he had made to himself long before their paths crossed. "You're not doing this for me," she said slowly, the realization settling like a stone in her chest. "You're doing it because you know what it feels like." Ethan gave a small nod. "Helping you is part of fixing something that's been broken for a long time. Not just in me. In the world." The words hung between them, heavy with honesty. Sarah felt her throat tighten. For so long, pity had been the currency others tried to offer her, shallow sympathy that turned to judgment the moment she resisted. But this was different. Ethan's gaze carried no pity, only recognition, as if he understood her in a way she had never allowed anyone to. For the first time in years she felt the faintest thread of trust, fragile as glass but real. She still did not know what this man wanted from her, if anything at all, but she began to believe that maybe his presence in her life was not an accident, not some cruel twist of fate, but the beginning of something that could change everything, not just for her, but for the 2 small girls who now giggled at the table, blissfully unaware of the shadows their mother had been running from. The courthouse was a cold, imposing structure, all marble floors and echoing hallways that seemed designed to intimidate. Sarah held the hands of her daughters as they walked in, though the twins were too young to understand the gravity of the place. They skipped clumsily beside her, their small shoes tapping against the polished tiles, the sound far too innocent for the building's severe atmosphere. Ethan walked beside her but slightly behind, not hovering, not crowding, just close enough to remind her she was not walking into this battle alone. Olivia Hunt, sharp and focused, carried a briefcase in one hand and moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where to place her feet in rooms like this. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with formality. The judge sat at the bench, her expression stern and unreadable, a woman who had likely heard every excuse, every lie, and every plea imaginable. Mark Dalton arrived late, his entrance as deliberate as everything else about him. He wore a long, expensive coat and a smirk that flickered between arrogance and charm, the kind of expression that once convinced neighbors he was a devoted husband and father. He walked as though the floor itself belonged to him, and when he looked at Sarah, it was with the same cold confidence she remembered all too well, a silent reminder of every time he had told her she could never escape him. The proceedings began, and Sarah felt her stomach twist as Mark's attorney launched into a performance, painting her as unstable, irresponsible, incapable of providing for 2 small children. Mark sat with his hands folded, his voice syrupy when he was called to speak, describing her as emotional and prone to exaggeration. He smiled at the judge as though they were allies sharing an inside joke, as though he expected her to lean in his favor simply because men like him usually got their way. For a moment Sarah's chest constricted, her breath shallow, the weight of his narrative pressing down on her like it always had. But then Olivia stood. Her movements were precise, deliberate, as though she had been preparing for this case her entire career. She began with the bus incident, placing a stack of documents and a flash drive on the judge's desk. Surveillance footage from the highway showed the bus stopping, the doors opening, and Sarah stepping off with her children in the freezing night while the driver waved her away. Officer Reed's written statement confirmed her account, detailing the report he had taken at the clinic. Olivia's voice was calm but unyielding as she spoke of a mother left stranded not because of her own failings but because of cruelty and negligence. Then she shifted to Mark's financial control, laying out bank records that displayed transfers, withdrawals, and the calculated freezing of shared accounts. She highlighted each instance with crisp precision, showing not only the pattern but the intent behind it. This is not the behavior of a father concerned with his children's well-being, she told the court, her words sharp as glass. This is a pattern of manipulation designed to strip a woman of her independence and force her into reliance on him. That is not protection. That is control. Sarah watched Mark's expression falter for the first time, the mask slipping as his jaw tightened. He tried to interject, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. Ethan remained quiet beside her, his presence steady, a silent anchor keeping her grounded as her ex-husband's carefully built facade began to crack. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was firm and unwavering. She acknowledged the evidence presented, the testimony of Officer Reed, and the clear record of financial abuse. She ruled that the children would remain in Sarah's custody and granted a 6-month restraining order against Mark. The word struck Sarah like a sudden gust of wind, leaving her both dizzy and breathless. For so long she had prepared herself for disappointment, for another loss, that the sound of victory felt almost unreal. As the courtroom emptied, Sarah walked slowly, her knees weak, her daughters tugging at her hands, oblivious to the shift that had just occurred in their lives. Olivia leaned close and murmured, "You're free, for now. He'll try again, but today you won." The words carried both reassurance and warning, but Sarah clung to the first part. Mark passed by them in the hallway, his smile gone, replaced with venom in his eyes. He leaned close enough that only Sarah could hear. "The money will run out," he hissed. "And when it does, you'll crawl back." Before Sarah could react, Ethan stepped forward. He did not raise his voice, did not move with aggression, but his presence was enough to stop Mark in his tracks. His gaze was cold, steady, and without a trace of fear. "She doesn't have to crawl anywhere," Ethan said evenly. "She has choices now. That's something you'll never control again." Mark glared at him, but the authority in Ethan's tone left no room for argument. He turned sharply and strode down the hall, his footsteps echoing with the hollow sound of defeat. Sarah stood there, her heart pounding, her body still trembling from the confrontation. She looked down at her daughters, who were tugging at their bunnies and laughing at something only they understood, and for the first time in years she felt the fragile stirrings of hope that maybe the world could tilt in her favor. She turned to Ethan, her voice quiet but steady. I still don't know why you're doing this, she admitted. Ethan's expression softened slightly, though his posture remained strong. Because someone should have stood up for you long before now, he said. And because no child should watch their mother fight battles alone. Sarah swallowed hard, unable to answer, but in her silence there was a recognition she could not ignore. She was not healed, not safe forever, not free of the man who had haunted her for so long. But she was no longer completely powerless, and that changed everything. The days that followed the court hearing passed in a blur of exhaustion and fragile relief. Sarah spent much of her time simply watching her daughters play, marveling at how quickly children could find laughter again even when the adults around them were carrying the weight of battles. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe without the constant fear that Mark might walk through the door. Still, in the quiet moments, doubt crept in. She wondered how long this reprieve would last, whether she could truly build something new from the ashes of the life she had fled. She told herself not to rely on Ethan, not to let gratitude blur into dependency, but every time she saw him with the girls, patient, kind, and unhurried, her defenses weakened a little more. One crisp October afternoon, Ethan suggested a drive. He offered no details, only a vague smile and the assurance that it would not take long. Sarah hesitated at first, uneasy with surprises, but the girls squealed at the mention of an outing, their little hands clutching their bunnies as if the plush toys could come too. Eventually she agreed, settling into the passenger seat while the city unfolded outside the window. The farther they drove, the quieter the streets became, until the tall buildings gave way to tree-lined roads where orange leaves scattered across the pavement and pumpkins decorated porches in preparation for Halloween. When the car slowed, Sarah felt a strange flutter in her chest. They pulled up to a small house with a pale blue front door and a white porch that looked freshly painted. The lawn was neatly kept, and the path leading to the entrance was lined with lanterns, each one glowing faintly in the afternoon light. The house was modest compared to the skyscrapers they had left behind, but it radiated warmth in a way that made Sarah's throat tighten. There was a sign planted in the yard that read Bridge Lighthouse number 1000. She stared at it, not understanding, until Ethan stepped beside her and explained. 10 years ago I started the Bridge Light Fund, he said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. We buy or build homes for families who are trying to escape abuse, poverty, or anything that keeps them trapped. This one marks our 1000th house. And it's meant for you and the girls. For a moment Sarah thought she had misheard him. She shook her head, laughing in disbelief, though her laughter broke in the middle, sounding more like a sob. That's impossible. We were stranded on a highway just days ago, with nothing but a couple of bags. This can't be real. Ethan's gaze was steady, his expression gentle but unwavering. It's real. Sometimes the world is cruel, but sometimes it can surprise us. This is one of those times. The twins, oblivious to the weight of his words, were already toddling up the path, their little voices chiming with excitement as they tugged at the door. Sarah followed, her steps unsteady, her mind still trying to reconcile the idea of safety being handed to her after so much struggle. When she opened the blue door, the smell of fresh paint and new wood filled her senses. The living room was cozy, with sunlight streaming through wide windows, a rug spread across polished floors, and a couch that looked untouched. In the kitchen, she saw counters that gleamed, cupboards already stocked with basics, and even a small magnet on the refrigerator that read "Today will be better than yesterday." She moved down the hallway, her heart pounding, until she reached a room with 2 small beds side by side. Each was dressed in soft quilts, one pink, one pale yellow, with shelves above them lined with children's books and painted dolphins. There were even small lamps shaped like stars, echoing the ones in the apartment where they had first found rest. The sight broke her. Tears filled her eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. For years she had fought to give her daughters even the smallest scraps of security, and now here was an entire house built for them, waiting like a promise she never thought she could keep. Behind her, Ethan's voice was quiet. The house will be put in a trust under your name. That way it's protected. Mark can't touch it. No one can take it away from you." He paused, then added with equal calm, "And if you want, there's a position open at Northbridge. Operations coordination. It isn't charity. I've seen how you plan, how you think. You got your girls across miles with no money and no safety net. That's logistics. That's strategy. Skills like that are worth more than you realize." Sarah turned to face him, her cheeks wet, her hands pressed against the doorframe as though she needed something to hold her upright. "This feels like a shock," she whispered, her voice raw. "Not the kind that destroys, but the kind you can't process because it feels too good to be true." Ethan gave a faint smile, one that didn't reach for her gratitude but instead acknowledged the truth of what she felt. "It's supposed to be," he said. "Sometimes the best kind of shock is the one that reminds us the world can be kind, even after everything we've seen." The girls were already bouncing on their new beds, their laughter echoing through the room, their little hands clutching the soft quilts as though they had discovered treasure. Sarah leaned against the wall, her chest heaving with silent sobs that carried both grief and relief. The past had carved deep wounds into her, and the scars would not vanish overnight. But standing there, in a house with a blue door and the sound of her daughter's laughter filling the air, she realized that for the first time in years, she was not standing at the edge of survival. She was standing at the threshold of a future. The year that followed felt to Sarah like learning to breathe again after holding her lungs empty for far too long. The blue house became more than walls and a roof, it became a heartbeat, a sanctuary, a place where mornings began not with fear but with the clatter of cereal bowls and the sound of Lily and Lucy's laughter spilling down the hallway. The girls grew fast, their curls a little longer, their words tumbling over each other in the rush of discovery, and their days filled with drawings of bunnies and chalk pictures across the porch. The once timid children who had clung to her in fear now ran confidently through the yard, their voices carrying into the street like bells. Every time Sarah saw them race barefoot across the grass she felt a pang in her chest, a mixture of joy for what they had now and grief for everything they had been denied before. Her own life changed as steadily as the turning seasons. She began at Northbridge tentatively, taking the position Ethan had mentioned in logistics operations. At first she doubted herself, expecting each day to prove she was unqualified, but instead she discovered that the skills she had honed while surviving under pressure translated into strengths others recognized immediately. She organized routes with precision, anticipated obstacles others overlooked, and coordinated teams with a determination that earned respect. People stopped seeing her as fragile or broken, they saw her as capable, someone who turned chaos into order. The first time she presented a proposal in a meeting and her colleagues nodded in agreement rather than questioning her, she nearly wept in the restroom afterward, stunned by the unfamiliar sensation of being valued. Ethan remained close but never overbearing. He did not dictate her choices, did not press her into gratitude, and did not attempt to mold her into something she was not. Instead he supported quietly, whether by picking up the twins when she had late hours, by leaving books he thought she might enjoy on her porch, or by simply sitting with her on evenings when the past crept back and silence was easier than words. She noticed how he treated everyone around him the same way, with an attention that was neither performative nor fleeting. His wealth, his power, his influence, they were not shields or weapons for him but tools he used as naturally as breathing, as if it had always been obvious that money should serve people, not the other way around. Mark tried to claw his way back into her life through the courts, filing motions, sending letters through lawyers, but each time he was met with resistance. Olivia had become more than just her attorney, she became a fierce ally who anticipated every move, blocking each attempt with unshakable confidence. The restraining order held, and while Sarah knew the threat of him would never vanish completely, she felt no longer cornered. The fear had not disappeared, but it no longer defined her days. Each victory in court was not only a legal triumph but another brick in the wall that kept her daughters safe. As the months passed, Sarah found herself changing in ways she hadn't expected. She laughed more often, not the nervous laugh that used to cover discomfort, but genuine, unguarded laughter that spilled out of her without apology. She began to trust her own judgment again, making decisions without the weight of someone's disapproval hanging over her. Neighbors started coming by the blue house, some with pies or small gifts, some simply curious about the family that had moved in. When mothers from the community discovered what the Bridge Light program represented, they began arriving at her door to ask for advice, for encouragement, for the reassurance that they too could rebuild. Sarah, who once had nothing but fear to offer, found herself speaking words of strength she had not realized were her own. One evening in late summer, after a long day of work and the twins tucked into bed, Sarah stepped onto the porch where Ethan was already sitting. The air smelled of grass and distant rain, and the sky was streaked with the faintest traces of stars. He wore no suit, just an old sweater with the sleeves pushed up, a man at rest rather than a CEO commanding an empire. For a while they sat in silence, listening to the quiet, until Sarah spoke the words that had been lingering in her chest for weeks. "Sometimes I think this is all just a dream," she admitted softly. "Like I'll wake up and find myself back on that road." "If it's a dream," Ethan replied, his gaze still on the horizon, "then it's the kind where you wake up safe. And if it's real, then it's proof that sometimes life gives us another chance when we least expect it." His voice carried no pressure, only calm certainty, and she felt the truth in it. After a long pause he reached into his pocket and placed a small velvet box on the table between them. He did not open it with fanfare, did not kneel or dramatize the moment. He simply let it rest there, his hand withdrawing slowly. "This isn't an answer for you," he said quietly. "It's a question. Do you want this, us, not because you feel you owe me, not because it seems like the right step, but because you truly want it? I'll never ask for a yes built on fear or obligation." Sarah stared at the box, her heart pounding, her mind racing through memories of every man who had demanded something from her, every moment she had been forced into choices that were not her own. This was different. Ethan was not demanding. He was offering. The difference felt so profound she almost wept. Slowly she looked up at him, and for the first time in years her voice carried no hesitation. "I don't choose the miracle," she said, her words steady. "I choose the man who stopped on the highway. And yes, I want this." From inside the house came the sudden sound of giggles as the twins stirred, half awake, squealing, "Yay," without knowing why. Sarah laughed through her tears, the sound breaking the tension as the stars brightened above them. For the first time, she was not standing in survival, not clinging to the edge of despair. She was standing in the middle of a life she had chosen, surrounded by the people who gave it meaning. Sometimes shock is not the kind that destroys but the kind that heals, the kind that shakes a life awake in the best possible way. For Sarah Miller, the shock was knowing that the world could be kind again, that love could be safe, and that her daughters would grow up in a house with a blue door where tomorrow was not a threat but a promise.